Welcome to the Human Flourishing Project. I'm Alex Epstein. On today's show, I want to talk about arguably the biggest question in life, and yet it's a question that I think is rarely discussed directly or usefully. And that question is, how do we spend our time? And I mean this in the broadest possible sense. How do we spend the time in our lives? We all know we have very limited time on Earth. There's this ever-present question of how are we going to spend it? What's the best way to spend it? And this is a question, as I said, that is not often addressed directly at all. And I have some theories as to why, but it's important to just note that it's not addressed directly at all. From the following perspective, if I just say, let's say you have 80 years. Now, part of having 80 years is you need to take certain kinds of rational, productive actions to sustain your life and to keep it in good health for 80 years. And that's a big part of thinking about how you spend your time. And I think some people think better about that kind of thing, some people not. So it's addressed in that way. But if you think of it from the perspective of flourishing, living to your fullest potential, enjoying life, it's an intimidating question. And I think this is part of why it's neglected. But it's like you only have so much time on Earth. You can do very limited things compared to what you can imagine doing. What activities, what actions, what experiences is your life actually going to consist of? And how do you make those decisions? And I think if we take this question seriously, it is a daunting question because particularly in the modern world, there are so many options. There's so much opportunity. And what do we do about that? Because if we don't do it well, what happens is we could pick something that's very suboptimal in terms of what's possible. We could also be second guessing ourselves all the time about what we're doing. So we're wondering, well, would this be better? Would this be better? Would this be better? And then that second guessing is going to make life less enjoyable by itself. So if you just think about, okay, what do I want to be doing in work? What do I want to be doing in personal relationships? The one I'm going to focus on most today is just what do I want to do with my leisure time, or what I sometimes call my play time. Like thinking about that is really daunting in and of itself in terms of, there are all these different places I could travel and all these different things I could do on my weekends. What do I actually want to do? And I think a lot of us have the experience, particularly with the weekends, as I've discussed on a couple previous episodes, where we think, is this really the best thing I could be doing with my weekends? They're like, something is off here. I could just, because sometimes I'll spend my free time in a way that just seems amazing. And then sometimes it's just, I can't even figure out, like I'm looking for something to watch on Netflix. Like, is that really even close to the best of what's possible? And yet it's a hard thing to do, but nothing could be more important. So this question of how do we spend our time on Earth, it's a hard thing, and yet it's an incredibly important thing. So I want to talk today a little bit about how I've come to think of it and what's worked for me in general, and then some new things that I'm thinking of, particularly that I've been applying in the realm of leisure time that I'm finding very helpful, which are a continuation of what I found works in general. So let me start off with one broad claim about spending one's time well. And I don't know how much disagreement there's going to be, but it's one of these things that even if you agree in theory, I don't think most people agree in practice. And so I'll say that spending time well requires an impressive type of planning. I often like to say with a lot of things, you have to start by respecting the problem. And so the problem, in a sense of how do I spend my very limited time on Earth, that is a difficult problem. In a sense, it's harder than any specific problem because every specific problem is in some way a question of how do I spend my limited time on Earth. So there's this broad question, but it rarely gets anywhere near the attention of the specific questions. I think part of it is because it's so it can be so overwhelming. Like, how do I even begin to think about that? There are so many options and so many different things I could do. And it's hard to think about, I'm actually never going to go to these 25 places that seem good to go to, or I'm never going to do these kinds of hobbies that I might like. And just the deciding, the cutting off of things itself can be daunting to think about. That's a kind of hard thing to think about. Okay, I'm never going to do this. And then what happens in practice, I think, is we get into certain kinds of routines that aren't all that well chosen. And then we're deciding by default to not do all of these things, including some things we might like to do better. But the broader point here is this requires planning. So there's an impressive type of planning so that if we look back at our lives, we say, yeah, I'm really happy with how I spent my time. I really chose, given all the options, I really chose what I wanted to spend my time on, and I'm happy with that choice. That's a really impressive thing to do. It requires a type of planning that I don't think most people engage in or even know how to do. And I'm struck by how non-often it's even discussed, like how to think about this and how to do this kind of amazingly difficult planning. So what happens instead of planning? Well, I think one false solution to this problem of how do I spend my time is so-called spontaneity, which is just, I'm just going to follow life wherever it leads me. And I'm not going to be constrained by plans. I'm just going to do what I want to, when I want to, particularly with regard to leisure time. And then in general, I'll just kind of go where life takes me. And I want to push on this really hard because it is really not a valid solution, particularly for leisure time, where I think it's viewed as some kind of great thing. So three reasons about leisure time that apply to everything else, I think. So without planning leisure time, you cannot know what to do in the sense of having any idea what will be most satisfying. It requires thinking to even know what's possible, and then deliberating about what's possible. That just requires a certain kind of planning to think about the options, to think about the pros and cons. Of course, we can't guarantee that we'll be right in terms of we'll like exactly what we think we'll like, but it's just a fact that there's no way to know what the options are and no way to really have much of an idea about how they'll play out unless we actually do advanced planning. So I'll just take my own case. If I think, and I'm even taking it as somebody who's thought about these things in an above average way, but if I just take my own situation, so I'm in an environment that I like a lot in Laguna Beach, but if I just take any given weekend and I just go into the weekend without thinking about it, then so I can go to the beach, I can go on my one wheel, I can go to jiu-jitsu class, and all of these things are things that I've thought about in the past and explored because I thought I would like them. So even this example is somewhat inaccurate because it involves all these things that I've thought about. But nevertheless, there are a lot of other things that I could do with my time that I could like more than some of these default activities that I'm doing, or at least I could like them occasionally. So maybe I'd like going horseback riding with my girlfriend. And particularly when you start to talk about like longer term things, maybe, there's a trip that we could take that would be really, really fun and memorable. And one thing I notice is, often the trips I take, they're just caused by work, and then I might really enjoy it. Like my favorite trip ever probably was safari to Africa, and that was something that was brought about by work. But if I think about it, if I really am thinking about my time, I think, I would like to go every couple years to something like that. That kind of experience, observing that kind of wildlife, being in that environment, there's something unique about that just checks so many boxes for me. I need to do that. But that will only happen by some serious, serious thinking. And this relates to my second point, which is that, so the first point is you can't know what to do in terms of, if you don't plan, in terms of thinking through all of your options, because you won't, among other things, you won't have all your options in mind. The second thing is, without advanced planning, you can't do many options optimally or even at all. Many of the best things require planning. So certainly like an African safari trip, requires a lot of planning, setting the time aside, saving up the money for it. I don't think I need to go into more depth into what kind of planning that involves. And it's true of many other things. Even if I think about, I've been planning with a friend of mine, okay, I want to go snowmobiling in Utah. That requires a certain amount of planning. It requires saying, okay, when can I do this? When does this make sense with all of my other priorities and commitments? When during the year is it going to snow? How much? And then so many specific things. Even now, there's a second wave of coronavirus. And so how does that relate to, like, does it make sense to visit somebody? Maybe it makes sense to stay in a hotel, at least for the next several weeks or months, depending on the situation. The Utah hospitals, just all of these things require a lot of planning, and many of the best things do. So like snowmobiling with my friend in Utah, I love that. That is an amazing thing. And if I really think about it, I'd like to do that a couple times a year. Or visiting. My best friend is living far away from me. How do we spend more time in person? By default, we'll talk on the phone, which is good, but it's way better to be in person, but that requires advanced planning. And if I don't do the planning, I can't even do it. It's just not going to happen at all. And we could go easily a year without seeing each other. I'm sure many people go multiple years. So this spontaneity thing of just, I'm just going to be spontaneous with my time. It just means a lot of blindness to options and then foreclosing all kinds of options because so many of the options require planning. And this I'm focusing on leisure time, but this applies to every other area of life as well. And then the third thing is, I think without planning of a certain kind, you can't fully enjoy the activity, because there's something very special about having an activity where the experience is, I chose this, I'm doing exactly what I want to be doing, everything else is taken care of, I've thought through my options, this is where I want to be. That is a great feeling to have. And I think that when people are just in this mode of, I'm going to be spontaneous, there's this nagging guilt about, hey, maybe I should be doing something else. Maybe something else would make more sense. And that's there for a reason, because one hasn't really thought it through. And I find this definitely is true with work. When I think through, and I'll talk about how to do this in a second, but when I've really planned my work in the sense that I've decided this is what I want to be doing as against everything else, I can just sit there and be so locked in because I know I'm doing exactly what I want to be doing right now. And to have that with leisure time is great as well. So spontaneity in this broad sense is not a solution to how to spend one's time. Now, I should say, I do think that using some of the techniques I'll talk about, including what I'm calling life blocking, it can be good to have spontaneity. You can have blocks of time for spontaneity, and there's also spontaneity within things that are planned. And so that can be part of enjoying the plan. So I'll get more to that later. But in terms of a broad thing of, I'm going to be spontaneous in the sense of not planning, that is a losing strategy. Now, the other losing strategy that I think we use to deal with this massive challenge of how do we spend our time is to make massive indefinite commitments that are not very well thought through. And this is a sensitive area because you might think maybe I'm accusing some people of doing this who are listening to this. I'm not accusing anyone. I would just think about commitments that we often make. And the biggest ones, and I hasten to say, I really want to emphasize this for many reasons. I'm not against at all people getting married and people having kids. I think those can be, there's a very strong argument that is the best possible life involves that, or at least the best possible life for many people involves that. But I don't think most people are thinking about it, really thinking in terms of what do I want my time to be? And so I talk to lots of parents and they just have this experience of, I'm so overwhelmed all the time and I'm not doing what I want to be doing. And it wasn't thought through. And then I think just think about people getting married after very short amounts of time without really having the experience with people and without really thinking through what's our life plan together. And so this is an area where I think there's amazing positives possible, but they really require a lot of thought and a lot of planning, including recognizing the phenomenon of opportunity cost. That is, if I am having kids, that's a whole bunch of time that I'm not spending on something else. And again, this is somebody myself is very enthusiastic about having kids, but it needs to be recognized as a choice, because if it's recognized as a choice and the opportunity costs are taken into account, then it can be one of these confident choices where it's, yes, this is exactly what I want to be doing. And even if I'm waking up at 3 a.m. in the morning, yeah, this is what I chose. I wanted this because this is part of the best overall life for me. But I think it's so easy to make commitments without thinking about it, without really thinking it through. And I think in part because it's easy to think with relationships or with wanting to have kids, like, oh, this feels really good. I want this to last forever. And part of it is, I think I want it to last forever because I love the certainty that I feel, particularly at the front end of some of these things. Like, it just feels like this is right. I feel good. This is exactly where I want to be. I don't want to be doing anything else. Particularly at the beginning of things when people are just super infatuated and that's all they can think about is another person, or sometimes the prospect of having a baby, or they get baby crazy or baby fever when they see other babies, and it just feels like, this feels good. Life in this circumstance feels exactly what I want, and I want it to last forever. So now I'm going to make this commitment, and then it'll last forever. And this happens with work as well, just making hasty decisions based on, I feel a certain way. I feel very secure and good in this moment. And I think if I commit to this, then I'm going to always have this feeling, versus saying, oh, this is really good. This feels good. This is a sign there's something I want here, but let's think through, what is life actually going to be like under this scenario? And it may be it is the right decision, but it may be it's the wrong decision. And these are the most macro kinds of commitments, but there are all kinds of other commitments that we make. Just saying, like, okay, I'm going to, even if I think about, like, I do jujitsu, or I've had this experience with Brazilian jiu-jitsu where it was something that I chose and I really liked it. Sometimes these are the things that we actually want to do, but it did have that quality of, I go to this, like, this is something I always do. And it's pretty satisfying, sometimes very satisfying, but it's in my schedule. And there's a certain comfort there. Like, I don't have to think about other things to do because I have this and it's good and I feel like it's good for me. And when the lockdown happened, I couldn't go to jiu-jitsu, and that made me really recognize the opportunity cost. I'm spending time on jiu-jitsu. Do I really want to spend that? And now I've thought it through, and I think, yes, I do want to spend that time, but I spend it in a considerably different way than I used to. I spend a little bit less time. I spend the time at different times because I find it optimal at different times. And then I also approach it in a different way. But all of this is based on really thinking it through and really recognizing the options versus just like making the commitments and then feeling some comfort in, okay, well, I don't have that much time to decide what to do with, because there is a real difficulty in just having huge open-ended amounts of time that we can do anything with. That can be a very daunting thing. But my perspective here is that is your life. Your life is this huge amount of time that you can do whatever you want with. And that's a daunting thing, but it's an incredibly positive thing. But the way to deal with it is not this pseudo spontaneity, nor is it to commit ourselves without really thinking it through. It's to really think through how we want to spend our time. And so that raises the question, how do we think about how to spend our time? And here I want to talk about 3 concepts that I find very helpful. And I may want to do one or more episodes in addition to this one, but I think I can give you at least enough of an overview to help out quite a bit. So the concepts are life blocking, that's 1, ranked lists, that's 2, and calendar comprehensiveness, that's 3. And some of these I've talked about in different ways before, but I want to talk about them from this macro perspective of how to spend time. So let's do life blocking. Now, life blocking is the term I'm currently using for what I often call time blocking. And the reason I'm calling it life blocking versus time blocking is Cal Newport, whom I'm a big fan of. I devoted the last podcast to him. He he is advocating what he calls time blocking in a very specific way, which is allocating blocks of time for the day and the week and planning those in advance. And that is a kind of time blocking. I mean, you are creating a block of time, determining in advance what you're going to do versus what he calls the list reactive method, which is just you have the list of things in your email and a to-do list, and then you just sort of in a given moment when you're not at a meeting or a pre-scheduled thing, you just do kind of whatever comes to you from that list. And he's against that, and I'm definitely against that. So he talks about, you proactively time block it. So that is a valuable thing, but there's a much more macro form of time blocking. And he has I forget what his term is for it, but I'm going to currently just use life blocking for what I think is the most important type of time blocking, which is deciding in your life how much time are you going to spend in different categories of things. So the examples I've talked about, I think in the past, are just how much time in general do I want to spend in creation. That's my area of life in terms of productivity. So I talk about creation, recreation, rejuvenation, reflection, as in those are the 4 activities in life. Like every activity that you do can be fit into those categories. And then I have the different companions. Like these are the different companions that you have. So there's like romantic partner, there's family, there's friends, there's coworkers. I guess you could add pets. I would put that under family or romantic partner. So you have those kinds of companions. And then I talk about there are fundamentals underlying both of those, which are resources. So that's your financial situation, other financial type resources, assets, you might call it. There's environment. So there's just where do you live physically? How much do you like that? Then there's physical health, which is your physical health. And then there's mental health. And so I think of those as the foundation. So those are what I call those are my categorization of the 12 areas of life. But for our purposes, there's creation, recreation, rejuvenation, and reflection. And you can think of just in a broad way, take a first cut, like how much time do I want to spend? How much time do I want to spend on creative work versus how much time do I want to spend on rejuvenation type activities, but then recreation. And I'm including, you can think of it different ways and you can subdivide it however you want. You could think of recreation / leisure as family. I think there are very good reasons to do that. You could think of it as creation, particularly if that's your full-time thing. So if you're a stay-at-home parent and that's your career for a long time, you can think of that as creation and other things as recreation. But just that it's a useful thing to just think about, okay, I want a life where I'm creating things, where I'm rejuvenating, where I'm recreating, where I'm reflecting. And just even think about that has to happen sometime. When is that going to happen? How is that going to happen? And I find it just so helpful to think about in broad strokes. Okay, I want to spend my time, and it'll differ at different stages. Right now, it's a very high creation type thing. So if you look at my calendar, it's blocked off from 7 a.m. to 1 p.m. is creation time. Then I have recreation and rejuvenation from 1 to 2:30, and then from 2:30 to 6:30, I have more creation, and then sometimes I allocate even more than that. But that's quite a big chunk at this stage. I think at other stages it'll be different. In the future, I envision doing it from 7 to 2. Particularly in the future, having kids, like 7 to 2 may be the time that I want to do, particularly when they're young. We'll see what I think, but the key is just to think about, okay, I want these broad things in my life. What amounts of time do I want to spend? And most of the time, they don't overlap all that well. I think they integrate well. They all are part of a full life, but they don't overlap. So just thinking in a macro way, how much time am I going to spend? That's really useful. And then within that life blocking, it's thinking about, okay, what within say creation, what types of activities do I want to do? And that's going to relate to your specific field. But so for me, one is writing, sort of like long form content creation that I'm thinking about and I'm researching. So right now that's about 4 hours a day that I'm finishing up a book. That'll vary different times, but it's useful to think about, hey, how much do I like this kind of work versus how much do I like more responsive current commentary? That's another thing that I do. And it's related to another thing that I do, which is consulting. And then I do speaking, and I have other projects, including Thoughtful, which I've talked about, thoughtful.community, which will probably let people on soon. So you might want to check that out. And yeah, so I have these different projects. I really need to think about how much time am I going to spend on these, because I got to make that decision somehow. And it doesn't work well to make it in the moment. It doesn't work well at all. It's how do you think about in a given moment? Do I want to be doing one of these 5 creative projects, or do I want to be playing with my kid, or do I want to be learning the violin? Like, there's no way to, these are so incommensurate. I just find it impossible to think, to make all these different kinds of, to choose among all these different options in terms of thinking with a given amount of time, what do I want to do? The way I can do it quite effectively is to think in terms of what kinds of activities do I want in my life. So in a broad sense, but then within each of the categories, like within creation, within recreation, what kinds of things do I want to do? Roughly block out those amounts of time. And then within those, do the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is making ranked lists. But it's so powerful to think about what is the integration of activities that I want in my life, and roughly how much time do I want to spend on them. So I'll give you an example in the realm of recreation, which I've been thinking about lately, because I really have this locked in for work. And I've been working on this more for playtime. And I've talked in the past about Playtime Planner. I've gotten better over the years, but I still haven't fully cracked it. And I think I'm very close by using the same type of methods that I use in work and applying them to playtime. So here's one set of ways that one can divide up playtime. And some of these are overlapping, but if you think about what do I want in my recreational time, and I'm going to include rejuvenation in this because they can often go together. What do I want? Well, I can think of about 8 things, and they sometimes overlap, but they're sometimes discrete. Like, one is learning. So I like doing learning that's not the same as me working on a specific project at work. It might be learning about another field. It might be learning about one of my main fields, but reading other people in a more open-ended way versus I need this exact thing for this chapter that I'm working on. Okay, second thing is exercising. So I like a certain amount of physical exercise. Excitement is a big one for me. I like kind of just physically, well, they're physically and mentally exciting things. Like when I was in Hawaii, rappelling down a waterfall, or I really want to go paramotoring, and I keep having not enough wind for when I try to go paragliding, but that's still on my list. I like certain kinds of one wheel tracks are great for this, but then there's other types of one wheel that they're not very exciting because it's just a standard type of road. So excitement. There's rejuvenation. So it might be taking a nap or getting a massage or doing meditation. There's reflection, just thinking at a higher level about my life. I've talked on this podcast about altitude walks, which I really like, as well as the positive focus exercise, which I really like. There's pleasure. So, and that, there's sexual pleasure, pleasure from food. But I think if we think about our recreational time, we definitely want some intense pleasure there. Inspiration. So art, literature, including literature, movies, but just things, and it can be often, I would put a lot of nature in there too, in terms of just having that. And nature actually now that I think about it, may be another good category in terms of just sort of some physical connection to the natural world, so to speak. So I'll have to think about whether to add that. I put that under inspiration. There's also connection. So connecting, and particularly connecting to humans, although I guess it could also be your pet, but like talking to good friends of mine, of course, spending time with my girlfriend, connecting with her. So all of these, when I think about a weekend and my recreational time, I find it super helpful to think of these categories because I realize, hey, I want some of all of these categories. So I can either think of things that check multiple boxes in terms of these categories, or I can just fit all of these things in. And that may seem like a lot to do, but I find it super valuable. So I just notice it's on any given weekend, I really want to get some exercise. So there's a jiu-jitsu class that's an hour and a half on Sundays that checks that box. And I don't want much more exercise than that, but it's cool to know, okay, there's this specific need, versus if I'm just looking at a list of things that's just it has everything on it. So I could go to jiu-jitsu, or I could go horseback riding, or I could talk to my friend, or I just make a ranked list, but it's not categorized very well. It has all of these incommensurate categories, but they're all under recreation, but they're not all really the same needs. It's just super hard to say, like, oh, do I want to watch this movie, or do I want to go to jiu-jitsu? And now the thing is, no, those are different categories. I want to do a certain amount of this, so I'm going to fit this in, but then I want to do a certain amount of thing, like watch things that are like watching an inspiring movie or reading an inspiring book. And if I've already planned to do one thing in this area of inspiration, maybe that box is checked, and then I can figure out the other things. So I just find this so helpful in thinking about how to spend my time, because I've identified here are the kinds of activities that I want to do, and then I can choose among them. And this leads to the next one, which is ranked lists. So one way to do this is just to make ranked lists of, hey, what are the different things that I could do in this area? And then either plan them ahead or have them at the ready. So it could be, okay, rejuvenation, there are 3 or 4 things that I really like. So I can decide among those for my rejuvenation time. Or reflection, here are the different things. And so sometimes it's going to be, I like the same thing every week. I have quite a few of these where I just like the same thing every week. This is the thing that works best. Like, I really like, it's getting cold now, but like, I really like lying in the sand and going in the ocean in the middle of the day. So that's recreational and rejuvenation time. And like, that's just a perfect thing for me. There's not anything I can really imagine liking more than that. That's great. Sometimes though, with excitement, that's going to be something that's going to vary more, or connection. There are a number of friends I want to keep up with, so I have to think about that kind of thing. Inspiration is also like that. It's like, oh, there are different kinds of books I could read, different kinds of movies I could watch. Let me make a list of those, so that when it comes to planning that time, I can pick one that'll be good, and I'll have them at the ready. And I find this so valuable to have these ranked lists, so to have these categories, and then to have these ranked lists, because then it's really a buffet in the best sense of it, where it's, oh yeah, okay, I know I want to do this type of thing. And then, okay, here's the thing within that I most want to do. So if you take, I've been doing this recently with my girlfriend with vacations, just thinking about, okay, there are certain types of 3-day vacations that we can take that fit in really well to our schedule. So maybe we can take one of those a month. And okay, what do we want to do first? And then you just make a list of what would be the fun things that are good 3-day vacations. That means it has to be, let's say, maximum 3-hour flight to the place. So it's going to be on the western half of the United States. So there are certain things that would be longer. If we want to go to Africa, obviously that's not a 3-day thing. That's a different thing. But it's just so powerful to look at it and say, okay, look, we've got this blocked out. We've got one of these things a month. Which one do we want to do this month? Which one do we want to do next month? Which one do we want to do next month? And then you look at that, you think, oh my God, we're going to do so much cool stuff. That's amazing. But that is in no way guaranteed to happen if we're just being quote unquote spontaneous, because then we're just going to be limited by whatever has occurred to us. We're going to be limited by the lack of planning, and it's losing out on all of these opportunities. So it's this life blocking. It's saying, okay, there's this amount of time. It could be more or less, but it's like this amount of time. It's a specific amount of time. Okay, what are my options? Let me make a list for what goes in that time, and then I can do that and it helps a lot with long-term planning, because I think, okay, yeah, in the next couple months, I definitely want to do snowmobiling. Like, that's a big thing, and I want to make sure I see my friend that I haven't seen for almost a year, and I really want to make sure we do something together. Okay, so in the next couple months, those are the top things that I want, but I also really want to, I don't know, I probably don't want to do this, but getting paramotor training. Let's say I try paramotoring and I really want it and it's just an amazing thing, then maybe I'll do a 3-day paramotor training. And by the way, there are these different kinds of buckets. So one is there's like 3-day type weekends. That's one kind of thing. There can be, even if you're in a relationship, you can have, I recommend this, you can have days or groups of days where you each are doing something on your own. And so you can think of things in that category. You can also just think of 1-day things that you want to do or half-day things. And each one is going to have different things that are suitable. But I just find that it's so much more enjoyable to think about time that way when we make these high-level decisions about life blocking, and then we use ranked lists. Then we can be really happy with, wow, there's a lot that I can do in life, and I'm really doing the things that I want to do right now. So the final idea that I've talked about in the past that's relevant here is calendar comprehensiveness. And what calendar comprehensiveness means is that my calendar reflects all of the actions that I am committed to doing. And this includes commitments that are for others, but more broadly, just commitments, including commitments to oneself. And I think often people overcommit to others in terms of all kinds of things, but whatever they are, it's the idea that in my calendar is blocked out what I'm actually going to do. I actually have a limited amount of time. I actually have 168 hours a week, and I actually have 52 weeks a year. That time is going to be spent. Somehow I want to think through how to use that time. Now there's a lot of optionality in terms of how precisely you want to block it out. You don't need to block it out every half hour, certainly not on the weekends, but if you want that time to be quality, what I said before holds. That you need to plan it in some way. That's going to allow you to know what is optimal to do it optimally, and to enjoy it as much as possible. I very firmly believe that. So if we just take these examples of, 3-day trip, we got to plan those. Like, look ahead. Okay, we want to take our dog Sherlock to see snow. Okay, that's going to be one of the 3-day trips. Great. Let's block out a trip to Big Bear in March and do that. And these things they're not going to happen randomly. So they need to be blocked out deliberately. And I'm really starting to see the wisdom in Dan Sullivan of Strategic Coach. He and his wife have a process, and they recommend it to all the Strategic Coach participants, if they block out what they call their free days in advance. So these are days where they're not doing their primary productive activity, or they're doing different kinds of recreation and rejuvenation. And they just block those out. They block out, I think, 100 plus of those a year, maybe even 150 of those a year. So they do a lot. But however many you want to block out, I don't want to block out that many at this stage of my life, but I see so much why you want to plan those, why you want to have them marked off, because otherwise your life is not actually time blocked. It's not life blocked in the way that I'm talking about. Whereas if it is life blocked and you have these lists, then you can have a lot of fun and you can plan far in advance. And when you think in terms of calendar comprehensiveness, it's going to help make these decisions so well on an annual basis, but also on a weekly basis. I've been finding that as I continue to develop this practice for productive stuff, I'm so clear about what I want to be doing and when, and it makes me so much more focused, because I see the week ahead, and I see, like, I've got this writing block and no more, and I've got this block for consulting work and no more, and then I'm really making I'm choosing the things that are the highest leverage and that actually need to get done, versus just random stuff. Versus if I'm not committed to calendar comprehensiveness, and I'm not recognizing the reality of what things will take, it's just so easy to just do random things and then those are going to delay other more important things, or they'll delay them, or those important things won't happen. Versus if I'm saying, I really have in front of me, here's the blocks of time, here are the lists of the things that I could do, here are the spots in the calendar, let's fill this up as well as possible. And then I find that when I do that, it's just so much more productive. So it's more productive in the broadest sense, in terms of it's creating the most value in the least amount of time. So that is a lot of my current thinking about how to spend one's time. So using life blocking, using ranked lists, thinking in terms of calendar comprehensiveness. I've been really happy with the effects that these things have had on my life, and I hope that you benefit from them as well as share any techniques and tips that you have. So that leads us to wrap up. As usual, if you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, you can email me at alex@alexepstein.com. Also, if you want to discuss this on Facebook, go to facebook.com/Human Flourishing Project. And if you want updates whenever there are new episodes, go to humanflourishingproject.com. Definitely interested in any feedback on this episode in particular. If there's anything you want me to elaborate on in future episodes, definitely something I'm thinking about and I think doing some personal innovation on these days. So happy to talk about it more if there is demand. All right, that's it for this week. I'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been the Human Flourishing Project.